While on the topic of complete surrender, there can't be a better example of complete surrender and devotion to Atma Vichara than the next speaker, the pleasure of whom and the privilege of introducing to you all is mine. Friends, Michael James needs no introduction. Ever since, as a young man in 1976, he came to Arunachala and spent the next 20 years immersed totally in daily pradakshina and in the translation of Bhagavan's works. He has not veered from the path of devotion and self-inquiry. His complete devotion to his friend, Sri Sadhu Om, and to his Guru, Bhagavan, is an inspiration for all of us. He continues to spread the Swanubhuti of Bhagavan's teachings to various satsang groups and is readily available. His website, The Happiness of Beings, is a tremendous source of spiritual knowledge for all earnest seekers. Without further ado, I would request Michael James Ji to address this august audience. Thank you. Namaste, Michael.
Namaste, namaste. What you say about me is very undeserved. Somehow, like all of us, I have been caught in the net of Bhagavan's love. And when Bhagavan loves us so much, we cannot help but at least a little bit loving him in return. Our love is nothing compared to his love. His love is supreme, but his love is infinite, without limit, because he doesn't see us as other than himself, so he loves us as himself. We, on the other hand, have seemingly separated ourselves from him, so we seem to be a finite creature, so even our love is very finite, very partial, and it's mixed up with so many Vishaya vasanas, which are dragging our mind here and there. So none of us Bhagavan's grace is uncaused. It's not that we have ever done anything to deserve Bhagavan's grace. It is grace is his very nature, and all we can do is surrender ourselves to him to the best of our ability. But even to surrender ourselves to him is not possible without his grace. There's a very beautiful verse by Sadhu Om, if I can remember it. Ishtum unikilada et salem sayenan. I will not do any act that is against your will. Ishtum unikilada et solum solenan. I will not do any, I will not say any word that is contrary to your will. Ishtumunikalada et ninevu ennenan. I will not think any thought that is not according to your will. That's his resolution. But finally, he ends in the fourth line by saying, Ishtumide ninarulal idetri vepaye. That means, by your grace, fulfill this wish of mine. That is, I wish nothing but to surrender myself completely to you. But it's only by your grace that is possible, is the implication. So it's only by his grace, by his love, that we can love him. It's only by his grace that we can surrender ourselves to him. And surrendering ourselves to him is the pinnacle of love, because there's no greater love than to give ourselves entirely. And that's what surrender is. Some people have an idea, but Bhagavan's main teaching is Atma Vichara, self-investigation or self-inquiry, and that surrender is just an alternative. Even some people may consider it to be a second best. But this is a completely wrong understanding of Bhagavan's teaching. Surrender is not an alternative. Surrender is the goal. Surrender means surrender of self-surrender. The term in Sanskrit is Atma Samapanam. Atma here doesn't mean Atman in the sense of Atma Sarupa. It's not our self as we actually are, but our self as ego. So it is this ego that we are to surrender. And what is Bhagavan's teachings all about? Arunachala mena ahamainyane pava ahateve radupaya arunachala. That is whether it's in Arunachala Stuti Panchakam or in Upadesha Numalai, Uladunapdu and other works, Bhagavan's teachings from beginning to end, it is all about annihilation of ego. What is called self-surrender is just another way of expressing the same thing. Annihilation of ego and self-surrender are one and the same thing. So whether we think we are following the path of vichara or the path of surrender, surrender is our goal, complete, that is to give ourselves entirely to him, that is to dissolve back into the source from which we rose. So self-surrender is our goal. Bhagavan did sometimes say there are two ways, either investigation or surrender. The reason Bhagavan said so is not that these are actually two different paths. They're not actually two different paths, but because people are of different nature, presenting the one path in terms of bhakti, in terms of surrender, appeals to some people. Presenting it in terms of jnana appeals to other people. But to many of us, both appeal. Everything about Bhagavan's teachings appeal. And there really is no difference. Bhagavan made this very clear in the, that is the main paragraph in Nana that deals with surrender, is the 13th paragraph. And Bhagavan begins that paragraph by giving a very beautiful and very clear definition of what is surrender. What he says in that sentence is, Anma chintane tabira, vera chintane kalambavataku, satram idum kodamo, apmanishta paranai, iripade, tanne isanaku alipadam. What that means is, Atmanishta paranai iripade means being Atmanishta paran. Atmanishta paran means one who is firmly established as oneself. So being Atmanishta paran, Tane isanaku alipadam, that is giving oneself to God. So how to be Atmanishta paran is what he explains in there's an adverbial clause in which Bhagavan explains that. That is the beginning, the first half of the sentence. In that adverbial clause, what he says is, Atma chintane tabira, accept Atma chintane. Chintana in Sanskrit is, or chintane in Tamil, means thought. So Atma chintana literally means thought of oneself. But that is just that's another way of expressing self-attentiveness. If we're thinking of ourselves, we're attending to ourselves. Self-attentiveness, that is self-investigation. That is, how do we investigate ourselves? Only by attending to ourselves, by looking at ourselves very carefully. So accept Atma Chintana, in other words, accept self-attentiveness, vera chintane kalambavadaku, satram idum kodamo, without giving even the slightest room to the rising of any other thought, except Atma Chintana, except self-attentiveness. That is the way, that the implication is, that is, the whole sentence, we read it together, is being Atmanishta paran, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than self-attentiveness, alone is giving oneself to God. That is the means to be Atmanishta paran, to be firmly established as ourself, is to be so keenly self-attentive but we thereby give no room to the rising of any other thoughts. That is, no thought can rise unless we attend to it, because thoughts don't actually exist. They seem to exist only in our view. So if we don't look at them, they don't exist. So there can be, if we attend to ourselves so keenly, but we don't allow our attention to be diverted away to anything else, there'll be no chance for any thought to arise. And thereby we are established in ourselves. And that alone, Bhagavan says, Atmanishta Paranai irpadei, that implies alone. This alone is giving ourselves to God. There is a reason for this. That is, as I said, but what we are to surrender is ego. Ego is not, we cannot surrender what we actually are. Our real nature we cannot surrender. We obviously cannot give up what we actually are. But now we seem to be ego, but ego is not what we actually are. So since ego is only a false awareness of ourselves, we can give it up. But how to give up ego? We need to understand the nature of ego in order to understand the means to give it up. Bhagavan has made this very clear in so many places, that this is one of the core principles of Bhagavan's teachings, but he perhaps expressed it nowhere so succinctly and clearly as in verse 25 of Uludunapadu. What he says in verse 25 of Uludunapadu, he describes ego as a formless phantom. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. It's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. Since it has neither form nor substance, it doesn't actually exist, but it seems to exist. The substance, but that is, because it has no substance of its own, it needs to borrow its substance from somewhere else. So the substance means existence and awareness, it borrows from Satchit. So that is, Satchit is just the fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. That is Satchit. So ego borrows that existence and awareness from Satchit. And it borrows the form of a body. And it conflates these two together as I am this body. So as Bhagavan often said, ego is nothing but the false awareness, I am this body. That means the ego is that which is aware of itself as I am this body. So it's neither the body, nor is it Satchit, because as he said in the previous verse, verse 24, the body is Jadu Udul Nanenadu, the insentient body doesn't say I. Doesn't say I is a metaphorical way of saying it's not aware of itself as I. Why? Because it's insentient, it's jada, it's not aware of anything. So the body isn't aware of itself as I. So ego cannot actually be the body because ego is aware. So is ego Satchit? No, it cannot be, because as he says in the next sentence of verse 24, Satchit Udiyadu, Satchit doesn't rise. But ego is something that rises between these two, between the body and Satchit. Rising between is again a metaphorical way of saying it. That is, there's no space between Satchit and the body, because Satchit is the substance and the body is just the form. So there's no space between the gold and the gold ring. That is, there's a relation of substance and form. So there's no space between. So what Bhagavan means by in between is it is neither this nor that, but it partakes of the properties of both. So in between, one thing, I, rises as the extent of a body. That one thing, that is Chit Jadagranti, that is Bandham, Jivan, Nupame, the subtle body, the samsara, mind, and ego and mind. So, this is, so ego is this formless phantom, which is neither Satchit nor is it the body, but it borrows the properties of both. And as Bhagavan says in verse 25, Urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. Urupatri nikum, grasping form, it stands. Urupatri undu mika ongum, grasping and feeding on forms, it expands, or it greatly expands, it flourishes. It flourishes by grasping and feeding on form. Uruvitu urupatram. Leaving one form, it grasps another form. What Bhagavan is indicating here is that grasping form is the very nature of ego. Any form that ego grasps is something other than itself, because ego itself is formless. So how does this formless phantom grasp forms? Grasping here means attending to, being aware of. So being aware of anything other than ourselves is grasping form. So ego comes into existence grasping form, it stands grasping form, and grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes. So this is the very nature of ego. And if it leaves one form, it grasps another form. But this is the important thing. In the next sentence, Bhagavan says, Tedinal autum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. That is, if ego, instead of grasping other things, tries to grasp itself, tries to see who am I, it will take flight. Take flight, again, is a metaphorical way of saying it. It will subside and dissolve back into its source. If you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, and if Bhagavan tells you, no, it's not a snake, it's only a rope, look at it carefully. If you look at it carefully, what do you see? You're looking carefully at the snake, and then suddenly the snake takes flight, because you suddenly see it's not a snake at all, it's a rope. So the snake has taken flight, and what actually exists there, that is what exists. So what the substance of ego, what ego actually is only Sat-Chit. Sat-Chit is not ego, but ego is not, just like the rope is not a snake, but the snake is nothing but a rope. Sat-Chit is not ego, but ego is nothing but Sat-Chit. So if we investigate this ego, it will subside and dissolve back into its source. We will see that it is non-existent. It's what that means. So from this verse, what do we understand? The nature of ego is always grasping form, always grasping things other than itself. So if it investigates it, so only if it, instead of grasping anything else, if it tries to grasp itself, then only will it subside permanently. Then only will it manonasa be attained. So in order to surrender ego, we need to attend to ourselves. That's why Bhagavan says in this sentence, Atma chintane tabira, vera chintane kalambavatiku satram idam kodamul, atmanishta paranayirupte, tane isanaku adipata. That is the only way to give ourselves to God, is to cling so firmly to self-attentiveness that we thereby give no room to the arising of any other thought. So this is what surrender is all about. It's about surrendering ego. However, when we try to surrender this ego, we all face difficulty. The difficulty we face is that we are unwilling to let go of other things. Because we still have desires and attachments, we are unwilling to let go of other things. The seeds of those desires and attachments are what Bhagavan calls Vishaya Vasanas. Vishaya means what he refers to in verse 25 as uru, forms. Any object, any phenomenon, anything other than ourselves is a Vishaya. Vasana means an inclination. So our inclination to attend to and experience anything other than ourselves, that is a Vishaya Vasana. Those are the seeds that give rise to likes, dislikes, desires, attachments. So in order to surrender ourselves, we need to, our aim is to surrender ego, but in order to surrender ego must first be willing to surrender its will, at least to a great extent, because so long as the ego has a will of its own, it's not going to let go. So in order to let go and surrender itself completely, it needs to surrender its will. This is why surrender is usually expressed in terms of surrendering our will to Bhagavan's will. Not my, as Bhagavan says in verse 2 of Aranaksha Patikam, ninishtum enishtum. Your thought, your wish alone is my wish. I have no will of my own. I only want what you want. Imbeleku, that is happiness for me. So we need to, in order to surrender ourselves, we need to surrender our will. We need to give up all our likes, dislikes, etc. But how to give up all our likes and dislikes? the nature of ego is grasping, as Bhagavan says in that verse 25. The ego will always be grasping something. So the key to giving up likes, dislikes, and so on is bhakti, love. That is only to the extent to which we truly love Bhagavan, we will be willing to give up, will be to let go of other things. So we can weaken our Vishaya vasanas only to the extent that we have love for Bhagavan. What is Bhagavan? Bhagavan is nothing but that which is always shining silently and clearly in our heart as I am. So in order to give ourselves, surrender ourselves, and merge back into that I am, and remain just as that pure I am, we need to have all-consuming love. That is, the more we love Bhagavan, the more we will be willing to let go of other things. So bhakti, that is why Bhagavan often said, bhakti is the mother of jnana. I had lots of other ideas that I wanted to say, but the time I think is fairly limited, and there may be some questions. So maybe I should, I think we've got another 5 or 6 minutes. So if anyone has any questions.
Hi, Michael, you have another 10 minutes for questions and answers. So we have a few questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there signposts to say surrender is getting deeper along the way?
The more we are happy and peaceful and calm and unperturbed by whatever may be happening to us, that is, in other words, our detachment. The more we are detached from other things and have love for Bhagavan, the more we are surrendered. But this is not something we can see very easily ourselves, because the more our mind is purified, but if you've got a really filthy cloth, and you can't see the deepest stains in it. But if you begin to wash that cloth, you remove the more superficial dirt, and then you find the more deeply ingrained dirt. Likewise, in this path, in the spiritual path, we are undergoing a process of purification. The more the mind is purified, what are the impurities? The impurities are Vishaya vasanas. So by this practice of self-investigation and self-surrender, we are weakening the Vishaya vasanas. But when the weaker ones get washed off, as it were, we begin to recognize how deeply rooted some of our Vishaya vasanas are. So the impurities in the mind become clearer to us the more our mind is purified. So that is why if you read any devotional literature, the works of Manikavasika or Murugan or Sadhuvam or most of all Bhagavan, they will talk as if they are the worst of the worst. Why is that? Because they're not just, it's not just a show. They're not just putting, it's what they actually feel. Because when as the mind gets purer and purer, we become more and more painfully aware of the obstacles that stand between us and Bhagavan. The obstacles that stand between us and Bhagavan are nothing but our own desires and attachment, and our unwillingness to let go of everything. So it's really, it may seem after many, many years of sadhana, but we are even worse than we were. That is because previously we weren't able to see our unworthiness so clearly as we now see our unworthiness. So truly speaking, we cannot, there's no clear sign that we are progressing on this path. Bhagavan often used to say, when people used to ask, Bhagavan, are there any signs of progress? Bhagavan said, the only sign of progress is perseverance. That is, if we are persevering in following this simple path of self-investigation and self-surrender that Bhagavan taught us, that is the sign of progress. Why? Because why do we persevere? Only because of love. What motivates us to follow this path? When there's so many nice things out in this world, the natural tendency of our mind is to go out to all these wonderful things in the world, seemingly wonderful, not really wonderful, but the mind gets enamored with all these things. That is the nature of the mind. So in order to follow this path of self-investigation and self-surrender, without love, nobody is going to follow this path. So to the extent that we are persevering, patiently persevering in following this path, that is the measure of our love. So that's why Bhagavan said, perseverance is the only sign of progress.
From YouTube, we have a question relevant
Yes.
to your answer just now. Can you please share one such experience of surrender in your path to Bhagavan along the way? Just to give an example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bhagavan's path is not about experience. Our aim, if we think of our path in terms of self-investigation, our aim is not to have any experience. It is to investigate and know the reality of the experiencer. If we think of our path in terms of self-surrender, our aim is to surrender the experiencer. That is, who is it who experiences all this? To whom do all experiences occur? Me. That me is ego. Our aim is to investigate and surrender this ego. So talking about experiences is just a distraction. Yes, when we're following the path, all sorts of experiences may come and go. But no, whatever comes and goes, as Bhagavan said, is not real. What is real is only what is ever existing. What is ever existing is only I am. So talking about experiences is just distracting us away from focusing on that which is ever present, that which is ever experienced, that which is nirvisesha. All other experiences are visesha. So we can talk about them, describe them. I had such and such an experience, I had a vision of God, or whatever it is, or I experienced great bliss, or I had a state without thoughts. People describe all sorts of experiences. All those are visesha. Visesha means they have a distinguishing features, distinguishing characteristics. That's why we're able to distinguish one experience from another. But that which is nirvisesha, which has no distinguishing features, that alone is real. That is I am. That is what we are investigating. What is ever present. What is present not only in waking and dream, even in sleep it is present. It's about one thing underlying all these three states, where one thing underlying all experiences is that fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. So that alone is real. So let us not worry about whatever experiences come and go, they're not real, so they shouldn't concern us. But so long as we are interested in experiences, our mind is going outwards, away from ourselves, towards something else. So let us know, let us investigate and know the truth of the experiencer, and thereby surrender this experiencer completely.
So along Atma Vichara or self-surrender, along the way,
yes,
how to give up the anger, emotions, ego that comes up repeatedly, and how to see our inner self.
Okay. So long as there are Vishaya Vasanas, the Vishaya Vasanas are the seeds. Those seeds arise, the first manifestation of those seeds is likes and dislikes. Likes and dislikes then sprout into desires, attachments, aversions, fears, and so on. And then the result of having desires, attachments, and so on, all other types of emotions, anger, all these things come. Why are we angry? Because things haven't gone the way we like them to go. If everything is happening as we like it to happen, we're not angry. When something happens that we dislike, we get angry. So anger is caused by our dislikes. The dislikes are nothing but the sprouting of our Vishaya Vasanas. So it's at a deep level. In this path of self-investigation and self-surrender, we are tackling the root itself. That is, even these Vishaya Vasanas, whose Vishaya Vasanas are they? Who is it? Vasana means an inclination. Who is inclined to like this or to dislike that? It is I, it is this ego. So when we're investigating and trying, and thereby trying to surrender this ego, we are cutting at the very root. So automatically, if we follow this path, all these other things like anger and things, they will, that is anger behind, what is the energy behind anger? It's that strength of attachment, of desire, of likes and dislikes and so on. The more we are weakening ego, if vasanas are getting weaker, then we will be less affected by anger and things. But even this anger, it is another experience. It's something unreal. Supposing you get, that's why people sometimes say to Bhagavan, oh, Bhagavan, I'm such a bad person. I have so much anger, or I have this or that. Bhagavan said, don't give reality to all these things. Investigate the one who says, I get angry, or I am a sinner. That is in the 10th paragraph of Nana, Bhagavan says, however great a sinner one may be, if one gives, instead of thinking, oh, I'm a sinner, how can I be saved? One should completely give up, reject the thought that one is a sinner and be steadfast in Swarupa Dhyana, that self-attentiveness. If we do that, then we will certainly be saved. So let us not worry about anger or about anything else. If our interest is in knowing and being what we actually are, and thereby surrendering this ego, anger will be taken care of. That is, it's only when we allow our attention to go away from ourselves that we fall prey to anger or to any type of, to any Vishaya. That is, as soon as we allow our attention away from ourselves, we're already under the sway of our Vishaya Vasanas. And if we allow ourselves to follow the Vishaya Vasanas, we begin to like this and dislike that, and then desire this and have aversion for that. And then we have all sorts of hopes, all sorts of fears. And when things don't go our way, we get angry, we get upset, we get depressed. All these are later, all these are signs of how, to the extent to which we've allowed ourselves to be swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas. The whole aim of self-investigation and self-surrender is not to allow ourselves to be swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas, to cling to that alone, which alone is real. That is I am. The more we cling to I am, the less we are less we are being swayed by our Vishaya Vasanas, the less we are yielding ourselves to our Vishaya Vasanas. So let us yield ourselves to I am and not to any Vishaya Vasanas.
Thank you, James. I have one last question. Do we have to surrender the goal of moksha itself?
That is, Bhagavan has explained this very clearly. Moksha has a meaning only if there's bondage. So long as we write, what is bondage? In verse 24 of Ulujunapadu, Bhagavan said, bondage is nothing but ego. That is, so long as we rise as ego, we seem to be bound. We're bound by so many limitations. But in this path, if we're following the path of, there's only one path, but if we think of that path in terms of investigation, we are investigating the reality of the one who seems to be bound. If we are thinking of it in terms of surrender, we are trying to surrender the one who is bound. In the path of surrender, you don't care about moksha. You want to surrender yourself. So when we talk about moksha, it's as if something we're going to gain at the end. If I do my spiritual sadhana, whatever it is, sooner or later I will get moksha, I will gain mukti. Bhagavan said mukti is not gaining anything, it is losing everything. Because in the final verse of Ulujunapadu, Bhagavan defines mukti as nothing but destruction of ego. So when ego is destroyed, everything goes with it. Because as he says in verse 26 of Ulujunapadu, Ahande undayin anetumundahum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande indrail indru anetum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ahandeye Yabaman. Ego itself is everything. Adalal Yadu idu enju nadale overdal Yabamenor. Therefore, know that investigating what this is giving up everything. So moksha is not gaining anything, it is losing everything. When everything is lost, what is always present alone remains. So mukti is what is ever attained. So if we are thinking in terms of, I'm going to get mukti, that is a completely wrong understanding, because the I who wants to get mukti has to be destroyed. Then only when it's destroyed, then there is mukti. So who is liberated? It's not the ego. Ego is only going to be destroyed. What is liberated is what is always liberated, which is our real nature. There is never a moment when we are not liberated. The bondage is merely... But bondage seems to be there so long as we seem to be ego. But are we this ego? If we investigate ourselves, we will find we were ever that. So the liberation is the eternal state. All we need to do is to lose the one who is aware of itself as I'm bound to this little body. I'm this small person with all these, so many problems.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, we have 10 plus more questions on YouTube. We're running out of time.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so we really appreciate your sharing.
It's all Bhagavan. I've not said anything of my own. I've just said what Bhagavan has said, because Bhagavan, everything that we need to understand, Bhagavan has written in his own original works in Arunachyastuti Panchakam, Upadeshundiya, Uludu Napadu, Ekama Panchakam, Anma Vidya, Nana. In these few works, all that we need to understand in order to follow this path, everything Bhagavan has given in such a clear and simple way. So I have nothing of my own to say. I'm only just highlighting what Bhagavan said.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. We